So lots of you have asked me different questions on this subfence, what it is, when it's used, and how to make one. So I'm going to show you how to make one and how to use it and why. So a subfence is something that I would always build and attach to my saw whenever I'm making miters with small stock. Like this is just 1.5 inches wide by 3/4. And the reason for that is because it helps back the pieces up so that you don't have blowout, and so that you also have nice even cuts. Because you see here, there's parts of the saw where there's no fence. And so by making yourself a sub fence, you can line these things up right, wherever your mark is that you'd like to cut, with either this line or this line that you've already pre-cut into it, and get an exact cut that's backed up, that won't have any kind of blowout on it whatsoever. So this is how you make it. So how to make the subfence is get yourself a couple pieces of plywood. I have some 3/4 scrap here that I'm just going to flush up in the back and the edge. And I'm going to shoot mine together. And then I'm going to tighten it up with some screws. You could choose to use glue or not. You could choose to use screws or not. As long as it's firmly in place, that's what you want. So I'm just gonna countersink and screw this together. Also keeping in mind that at about the midway point here, I'm going to be having angles that come like this, okay? So I want to make sure that I stay out of this area with my pins and my screws. I have a subfence that's ready to go. You just want to make sure that you have them flush here at their connection, so that they're nice and flat and sit good on the fence. So let's go attach it to the miter saw. So I'm almost ready to attach my subfence to my miter saw fence. And how I'm going to attach it, I'm going to use the holes that are in the fence for screwing a subfence to it to screw my subfence to it. I just want to look and make sure that I have my center line right about where I want it. Doesn't have to be perfectly exact. We just want to make sure that we're not running into any screws or nails. Now that that's done, we also want to make sure that we have tightened these down and made sure that they're out of the way, so that any angle that we plan on cutting will have the clearance without running into this either one of these fences. Because both of these fences at the top, they do move. So you need to tighten them down out of the way. So now that you've done that, I'm ready to screw this to the fence. So now that we've attached the subfence to the actual fence, which you could also use clamps to do this if you choose not to screw it to the fence. And just make sure if you do screw it to the fence that you don't use the screws that are too long and they come out the front. What I want to do is set my saw to the angle that I want to cut. But if I just cut it as it is now, I'm going to cut right through my fence that I just made. And I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is adjust the depth on my saw here, which is this little lever. It's this lever here, okay? This comes down, this screw you can pull in and out, and it will stop the depth. And I've already set it the other day, so we're good to go. So now what you're going to do is, if I'm cutting picture frames, I'm cutting 45-degree miters. So I'm going to pre-cut my subfence so that I know exactly where to line my pieces up with their lines, so that they can be right on the money. Now, it's always a good idea to not pull the saw back through your cut whenever you're using a miter saw. Let the saw stop there, and when the blade stops spinning, then lift it up. It helps you not get pieces thrown at you, and it also helps stop chip out. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just make a piece. Let's say we're going to go like this. We're going to cut like this, and we're gonna cut like this. So now there's no trying to line up the saw blade with the actual mark, because we can just take the mark and put it right on where that cut line is already. Okay, so I'm gonna start there. And this is something that I would always use for very small pieces of, you can cut these tiny little pieces of trim with something like this, or picture frames, anything that's small that you plan to miter. Right, now I was able to cut right on my marks by just lining it right up really quickly with the subfence. Sometimes it may be necessary to add like a fur out piece or something like that, like I used on my how to create a half lap joint on a miter saw. And the reason for that was to kick it out enough to where I can have a nice flat cut without getting the bevel of the blade or the round of the blade in my cut. So it's kind of like an as needed basis, depending on if you need to fur something out. If you're just cutting angle stock like this to make your picture frames or whatever, you don't need that fur out piece. You just need to make sure that you've got the depth set correctly so that it cuts through the piece of wood that you're cutting without cutting through your actual subfence that you just made. And I can use this for multiple different angles. Once there's so much cut out here or here that it's not fully supporting your piece, then it's time to make a new one. You don't need this on every single cut you make, but if you're doing angles and trying to avoid any blowout or chip out and have them really nice and crisp, this is the way to do it, because you don't get any of that blowout. An important thing to keep in mind when you build your subfence is your saw, every saw has a maximum height cut capacity, which means you can't put an 8-inch piece of plywood here to use as your subfence, because this is not going to cut through it. There is a stopping point. So as long as you don't go too tall above your fence, as long as you stay right around there and so you can grab it with your screws and fully support your piece, then your subfence, whatever you make it look like, should be good. Just one more tip for your tool bag.